Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, the American Yawp, and our course assigned OpenStack's U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on empire, annexation, and the contradictions of 1898. The core question is this: what becomes of a republic's anti-colonial language once victory leaves it holding islands, ports, and populations that never consented to American rule? The core competency is to characterize the social, political, and economic dimensions of military operations, such as the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and the Great War. What becomes of a republic's anti-colonial language once victory leaves it holding islands, ports, and populations that never consented to American rule? In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain under language of liberation, humanitarian concern, and national honor, but battlefield victory immediately widened the problem. Cuba's rebellion, yellow press coverage, and the crisis around Spain brought intervention to the foreground. The defeat of Spain then forced a second decision about Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and the Philippines, where military success raised questions of sovereignty, occupation, and political membership. Many Americans recognized the contradiction quickly. Expansionists answered it by changing the language rather than abandoning ideals outright, speaking of order, tutelage, civilization, and preparation. Anti-imperial critics argued that annexation violated Republican principles of consent and self-government. Naval planners and strategic thinkers emphasized coaling stations, Pacific routes, and overseas bases. The debate over 1898 therefore turned on how far American power could move before liberation language became a cover for empire. The outcomes changed American policy because victory created administrative duties as well as military ones. Once the United States took responsibility for customs houses, police systems, provincial governors, ports, schools, and treaty obligations, empire had to be managed through paperwork, law, and routine supervision. The real test of 1898 was not the war alone. It was the machinery that followed once conquest had to be translated into rule. The background to 1898 included more than Cuban rebellion. The United States had already expanded across the continent through war, treaty, settlement, and coercion. By the 1890s, it had also become more industrial, more commercially ambitious, and more interested in global sea lanes. Alfred Thayer Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published in 1890, argued that great nations required strong navies, coaling stations, and strategic ports. Business leaders and policymakers thinking about Pacific trade heard that argument clearly. Overseas power promised access as well as prestige. Cuba remained the immediate crisis. Cuban insurgents had been fighting Spanish rule, and the harsh reconcentration policy under Valeriano Weyler intensified American outrage. In February 1898, the Delome letter, in which a Spanish official insulted President William McKinley, inflamed public opinion further. On February 15th, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing more than 260 American sailors. The cause remained uncertain, but the event helped make war politically possible. Remember the Maine became a rallying cry because it fused honor, grief, and anger in a form that Congress and newspapers could easily translate into action. The naval war quickly widened the map. Commodore George Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay on May 1st, 1898, before Congress or the public had fully absorbed what Pacific victory might mean. In the Caribbean, Admiral William T. Sampson's and Commodore Winfield Scott Schley's forces bottled up and destroyed Admiral Cervera's squadron near Santiago in July. These victories showed what Mahan's strategic language looked like in practice. Coaling stations, harbors, and islands carried strategic value because sea power could seize them and then use them as stepping stones for commerce and projection. Alternatives still existed at that point. The United States could have pressed Spain diplomatically, recognized Cuban independence, or limited intervention to a narrower military and humanitarian purpose. Congress tried to reassure the public through the Teller Amendment of April 1898, which declared that the United States disclaimed any intention to exercise sovereignty over Cuba except for pacification. That promise signaled that the war was not supposed to end in straightforward annexation of the island. Yet even before the war closed, the strategic horizon had widened beyond Cuba itself. Once American naval victories in Manila Bay and the Caribbean shifted the balance, policymakers faced a new map. Puerto Rico and Guam could serve strategic purposes. The Philippines opened a question of Pacific position, commercial access to Asia, and great power standing. The United States did not move from anti-colonial language to imperial control in one leap. It moved through a sequence of decisions in which each victory created another opportunity, and each opportunity demanded another justification. That sequence is essential to understanding why empire in 1898 looked contingent in the moment and durable in its results. President McKinley operated under mixed pressures. He had to manage public anger, congressional expectations, military opportunity, and foreign policy calculation at the same time. A rapid war against Spain could be framed as humanitarian and patriotic. A restrained settlement could satisfy anti-annexation opinion in Cuba. Yet once the United States occupied Manila and negotiated peace, McKinley also faced pressures from expansionists who argued that withdrawal would waste a victory, weaken national prestige, and surrender markets or bases to rival powers. Emilio Aguinaldo faced a different political reality. Filipino revolutionaries had been fighting Spain and expected independence after Spanish defeat. From Aguinaldo's perspective, American annexation meant that one imperial ruler was replacing another. The clash was therefore not about gratitude or misunderstanding alone, it was about sovereignty. Filipino nationalists sought self-rule. American officials increasingly described annexation as strategic necessity or civilizational duty. Those two positions could not easily be reconciled. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, formalized the transfer of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines from Spain to the United States, with Spain receiving $20 million, while Cuba remained outside formal annexation. In the Philippines, however, the issue did not end with treaty signatures. War broke out between American forces and Filipino nationalists in February 1899 after months of tension around Manila. Occupation required garrisons, supply lines, censorship, patrols, local collaboration, and repeated claims that resistance represented disorder rather than legitimate national aspiration. Empire soon became routine administration, tax collection, customs enforcement, school systems, policing, and the selection of which local elites would be empowered under American oversight. The Anti-Imperialist League brought public criticism to this process. Members included figures such as Mark Twain, Carl Schurz, and Andrew Carnegie, though their motives varied. Some argued from constitutional principle and insisted that ruling others without consent violated American political tradition. Others worried about military overreach, corruption, or the effect of empire on domestic liberty. Some carried racial assumptions of their own and feared incorporating non-white populations into the polity. That mixture exposes anti-imperial dissent as morally significant without being ideologically pure. Racial hierarchy also shaped expansionist language directly. Supporters of empire frequently described Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Filipinos as unready for full self-government and in need of tutelage. That language solved a practical problem for expansionists. If colonized peoples were described as immature, then control could be called preparation rather than domination. The vocabulary sounded temporary and moral, but the structure of authority remained unequal. The administrative state of empire rested on that distinction between declared care and actual command. The Philippine-American War made those abstractions concrete. U.S. forces under generals such as Elwell Otis and later Arthur MacArthur fought guerrilla resistance across Luzon and then in other islands. Reconcentration zones, village burnings, food controls, and campaigns against insurgent couriers became routine. After Aguinaldo's capture in 1901, military rule increasingly blended with civilian governance under William Howard Taft's Philippine Commission. School systems, constabulary forces, road building, and customs administration were presented as modernization, but each depended on military victory and unequal sovereignty already established by force. Territorial law quickly followed military occupation. The Foraker Act of 1900 created a civil government for Puerto Rico under an American-appointed governor and executive council, while the island remained subject to congressional authority. In Cuba, the Platt Amendment of 1901 required treaty provisions allowing U.S. intervention, restrictions on Cuban treaty-making, and naval basing rights at Guantanamo Bay. These statutes and conditions revealed that empire did not depend on one formal model. Washington could use annexation, protectorate language, or territorial administration depending on what the moment required. The legal logic was reinforced by the insular cases beginning in 1901, especially Downs versus Bidwell, where the Supreme Court held that full constitutional provisions did not automatically follow the flag into every acquired territory. The doctrine let customs duties, appointed governments, and unequal political status survive without immediate incorporation. In practical terms, judges supplied empire with a constitutional gray zone. Congress could govern overseas possessions, collect revenue, and delay full citizenship or self-rule while still claiming to act inside American law. Occupation therefore ran through courts and treasuries as well as through army posts.
Tariff schedules, harbor dues, school appropriations, censored newspapers, and constabulary patrols all helped convert battlefield victory into a durable system of supervised sovereignty. In April 1898, members of Congress wrote the Teller Amendment to solve an immediate political problem: how to sell war against Spain without sounding like a republic hungry for colonies. The crucial sentence declared that the United States disclaims any disposition or intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island except for the pacification thereof. Every major term in that line was doing strategic work. Disclaims, denied appetite, sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control, named the charge in full so it could be publicly refused. Then the escape hatch arrived in the final clause. Except for the pacification thereof was the operational opening. Pacification required officials to decide when order existed, what force could be used, how long supervision would continue, and who would judge the island ready for release. Those words let Congress renounce conquest while preserving administration, occupation, and leverage. The ink on the amendment told Americans they were liberators. The final clause quietly preserved room for governors, military commands, customs oversight, and later intervention. That is why the amendment reads less like a moral pledge than a carefully drafted instrument. Anti-imperial critics were watching. Foreign governments were watching. Cuban revolutionaries were watching. McKinley needed a formula that kept the war coalition together without foreclosing later control. The language delivered exactly that. It made restraint audible and left power usable. The record after 1898 exposed the full utility of the phrasing. The Platt Amendment of 1901 restricted Cuban sovereignty and preserved American intervention rights. In the Philippines, annexation and war stripped away the pretense of disinterested supervision and replaced it with direct occupation, reconcentration, and civilian military rule. The Teller Amendment had already supplied the grammar for that wider imperial project by teaching officials how to narrow the language of conquest while keeping many of conquest's practical powers intact. The consequence of 1898 was a wider and more varied American empire. Cuba became formally independent under strong U.S. pressure, Puerto Rico and Guam stayed under American control, and the Philippines moved from annexation to prolonged war and occupation. The legal forms varied, but the political reality was consistent. The United States governed or supervised people beyond the continent without extending equal sovereignty or equal citizenship on normal Republican terms. The legal structure deepened in the insular cases beginning in 1901, when the Supreme Court distinguished between incorporated and unincorporated territories and allowed overseas rule without full constitutional integration. In the Philippines, provincial governors, constabulary forces, school systems, reconcentration measures, and supply networks translated military victory into everyday supervision. In Puerto Rico, customs policy, appointed governors, and citizenship debates did similar work. In Cuba, intervention rights and economic leverage kept formal sovereignty conditional. Empire survived through differences in legal language, but the administrative skill was the same: preserve control while varying the justification. The anti-imperial argument therefore remained alive because it was asking constitutional questions the war itself had not settled. Could a republic hold colonies indefinitely? Could Congress regulate territories without full incorporation? Could a victory won in the name of liberation produce a permanent hierarchy of political membership? Those were not abstract problems after 1898. They were visible in court doctrine, rural pacification, customs houses, naval coaling stations, and schoolrooms built under occupation. That is why there is no tidy closing to the age of empire. Once the United States learned to describe unequal rule as supervision, order, or preparation, it gained a durable vocabulary for power without consent. The unresolved judgment is whether a republic can keep that vocabulary and still claim that its authority rests on self-government rather than on force and managed dependency.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.